I want to lay a couple things out this morning. One, being Christmas Day. You know, obviously we've studied many times. We don't know exactly the day that Jesus was born, but it's pretty neat knowing that there's an opportunity in the world that we can gather together as the church, that we can sing praises to God, that we can be able to focus on the fact that Christ lived in this world, that He had a birthday, whenever day it was, and that we've got an opportunity to just be together today, praising God together. Now, as we think about those things, I want you to just for a moment ask yourself, what does it mean for a denomination to exist? Now, what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look a little bit about what Jesus did on His time on earth, what He desired of each one of us, and what is so important and significant about Jesus' life that should still be continuing on today. So when we ask ourselves, what is denominationalism? Because unfortunately, that's something that has happened in this world where they took the church and started dividing it up into all these different groups and different buildings and different places and decided, hey, well, as long as we're all aiming at God, we're all going to be okay. So basically, to describe a denomination is a group of people that were within the church or wanting to join the church that added the Bible and their opinion, put them together, and ran with it. That's how denominationalism began. Just to make it as simple as I know how. The church as a whole was the church that Jesus died for, that He established, that worshiped with unity, that worshiped the same way together, that studied the Scriptures and they searched the Scriptures daily. Acts chapter 2 verses 38 through 42 teach us that the church gathered, they stayed under one roof, they stayed together, they were in different buildings as congregations and in different cities, but they had one purpose: follow what Jesus laid out for them and follow the examples that were given by the apostles. And that was it. So denominationalism in Acts chapter 2 did not yet exist. It wasn't there. It started dividing up later on throughout the years. The first time we get the big church split, you get Roman Catholicism that's out there, but you also get denominationalism brought in by instruments and different things that are brought in of people saying, well, we want to add, we want to enhance, we want to add to. So they bring in the opinion with what the Bible had already taught, and then you get your first church split. Denominationalism began that way. So as we study through the Scriptures, we're going to notice that Jesus is going to teach us some things. We're going to see in Ephesians that God, through the Apostle Paul, is going to give us some insight about how are we supposed to live. If we want to be in the church, what do we do and what does that mean? Starting in chapter 4, I want you to see verse number 1. Paul says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling of which you were called. So we'll pause there. Paul begins in this portion of the letter by saying he's a prisoner of the Lord. If you're a prisoner of someone, you're under their control. You follow what they give, the instructions they give. So Paul voluntarily says, I'm a prisoner of the Lord. He's going to do whatever God had instructed of him to do, and that's it. So let's jump back in the Old Testament with some stories you may remember very well. Noah's Ark. Now, we've taught that from Vacation Bible School all the way up to where we are today. We hear it in sermons, we hear it in VBS, we hear it in classes, we hear it in Sunday schools. We see it in pictures. We see it up in Kentucky where they built the ark. I don't know if you've been there yet. They took this congregation and we went there. It was incredible. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it's a good one-time trip. But let me ask you, what did God tell Noah to build this ark out of? He said, build it out of gopher wood. And so he said, and Noah starts to build this ark out of gopher wood. What if Noah thought within his mind, you know what, and I think anybody who lives in the South knows this, cedar does not rot very quickly. Cedar might be one of the longest lasting types of wood that you can put in the water. Cedar lasts for a good while, evergreen, stuff like out in California. It can last a whole lot. So why don't we build this ark out of cedar instead of gopher wood? What would have happened to the ark, do you think? Would have went to the bottom of the water because Noah would have been disobedient to God. You know what God did not have to do? God did not have to say, don't use dogwood, don't use pine, don't use oak, don't use cedar, don't use any of the extra stuff that might make it pretty. I know you really like mahogany, but don't put that on the edges just for extra looks to make it extra pretty. Don't put the staircases. They've got those little balls that you grab onto as you walk and slide your hand up the railing. I don't want you to go out and use, pecan wood to dress up the ark. God said use gopher wood. That eliminated any other kind of wood. Nothing else would be suitable. Nothing else would be acceptable. And if Noah did anything else, he would be being disobedient to God the Father. the exact same way you and I today, when we start to add to or take away from what God has instructed, we would be disobedient to God the Father. Nadab and Abihu. God tells them, I want you to build a sacrifice. I want you to build an altar to make a sacrifice on, and I want you to light a fire, and I want you to do it this way. Well, Nadab and Abihu, they did really good. They started building up an altar just like God had told them to. They started getting fire ready, and they thought with themselves, you know, God said fire, and He told us how to make the fire, but I know another way to make fire. They made fire a different way than what God said to. They were disobedient. They were struck dead in an instant. God ended their lives right then and right there because they built a fire a different way than what God said to. Now, so many times we'll say, well, that sounds cruel, that sounds evil, that sounds hateful. If you are going to teach your children to learn to be obedient to parents, what do? We punish for bad behavior. Things that are done with the wrong intention, things that are done wrong. If Noah had built the ark another way, it wouldn't have floated. He'd have drowned with everyone else in the entire world. We have a choice to follow God or not to follow God. Cain and Abel. One of the most basic principled stories we could possibly think of. Cain and Abel, the first murder in all of history. The first time we get someone that dies in all of history. And so you get Cain and Abel. God says, I want you to make a sacrifice. You ever thought about the fact that Cain and Abel both brought a sacrifice to God? I mean, they both did what God asked. They both brought a sacrifice. But God had been specific about what sacrifice He wanted and what He was looking for. Cain brings in, the best of what he's got, but the best of what he's got is not what God asked for. I brought you my best, but it's not what He asked for. And God very clearly tells Cain something. He says, I don't accept what you brought. Just because we slap a goldfish sticker on the bumper of our car does not mean God accepts what is being said in the driver's seat. Just because we wear a t-shirt that says, I believe, does not mean that God accepts what we offer to Him. God told us what He desires from us. And that's part of what Paul was beginning to lay out here in Ephesians 4. God has made it clearly, abundantly through the Scriptures, made it so evident to us what He desires from each one of us. We're taught in Hebrews chapter 11 at the very beginning of the chapter that all of the Old Testament was given to us, that we're not under the old law, we're under the new covenant, but we have the old law for two reasons. One, historical evidence, so we can prove the existence of God. And two, so that we can get to know the character of God through the examples that He gives us. We learned that from Hebrews 11. We also learned that from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Anywhere we want to read in there, God tells us the Old Testament was given to us today for our knowledge, for our learning, so we can get to know the character of God. Because who God is has never changed. And so when we get to the church today, what if we start changing what God said He desired from worship? What if we add a few things too? What if we take a few things away? If you add anything but gopher wood to the ark, it sinks. If you change the fire God had instructed for the altar to be built, it's not acceptable. If you bring something that God did not ask for, it is turned away. We are under the same God today that has always been for all of eternity. So when we read through the Scriptures, we've got to ask ourselves, what does God want from us? Continuing on in verse 2. With all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And here's where He gets serious about things. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Nowhere in there does He give us multiple options, multiple ways, multiple insights, multiple directions, multiple opinions. Nowhere in there. All the way through this chapter, He's telling us there is one. And sometimes we think it sounds, kind of selfish of God to say that there's only one way. There's only one church. There's not multiple churches. There's only one. It sounds kind of selfish and conceited, doesn't it? But I want you to think about what God did for us when He created one church, the Lord's church. No other options. He simplified religion and faith. He simplified what we follow. He simplified what we have to study and what we have to... He simplified it so much and brought it so much to just basic, here it is, this is one thing. And we went and complicated it, and we're the ones that are messing it all up. God loved us enough to make it so easy that there would only be one church. We didn't have to pick and choose from all the different belief systems. We didn't have to try to decide which God we wanted to follow. We didn't have to choose to decide, do we want to sing this way or that way? Do we want it to sound this way or that? God already laid all of that out. God laid out the way our homes are to be led. He laid out the way the family dynamic is to be built. God gave us everything, and He put it all under one category, the church. And then we started dividing it all up and making it so complicated. When we read through Scripture that God is not the author of confusion, and then you have so many people that'll say, then why are there so many churches? Because people started writing their own opinions. They took God and what He wrote, set Him to the side, and said, we're going to write some stuff too. And we're going to add some things in here. And as soon as we started doing that, our ship started to sink, because we wanted mahogany on the handrails when God said go for wood. Because we thought there was an easier way to build a fire, so we took a shortcut. Because we thought, God, as long as I bring you the best of what I've got, you have to accept it. God didn't just ask for your best. He asked for you to bring what He requested and the best of it. That's the difference. And so when we read through there and He makes those statements, there is one, there is one, there is one. God made it as simple and basic as He could for each one of us today. I want you to turn over, if you will, to Galatians chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse number 20 is where we're going to look. Galatians 2:20. Now here's a place in Scripture that every one of us needs to know. We're going to think back about 2,030 years or so. 2022. How about that? How about 2000? Something happened 2022 years ago. Jesus is born into this world. Literally, an atheist that says it's 2022 is telling you that they believe that Jesus was real, because that's how we keep time. That's where we get 2022. So we get 2022 years ago. Jesus came to this world. He was born into this world. He left heaven so that He could be here with each one of us. He lived His entire life avoiding temptation, avoiding sin, staying strong. The man stayed single. I mean, like, we've got people today that by the time they hit 19 years old, they're crying their eyes out and think they'll be lonely the rest of their lives. And yet Jesus lives 33 years as a single man, avoiding every temptation that could have been there, so that He could be on the cross because He loved each one of us. When we think about Christmas, you think about somebody that left heaven. I want you to think about this in the middle of July, in the middle of February, at the end of November, every single day of the year. We don't know what day He was born. I mean, there's people that recognize the day as being Christ's birthday. I'm glad they're at least acknowledging He was born, but we don't know what day it was. And so when we think about Jesus being born, why did He do that? He did that so we could have this one church. So that the one church that He was helping to establish would be here. Let's look what He says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. This is what Paul writes. I've been crucified with Christ. Basically, I've been put to death with Him. So Paul says, there's no more of me. I was put to death with Christ. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live. Well, if it's not Paul, then who is it? But Christ who lives in me. What does that mean? What does it mean to put yourself to death with Christ and then to allow Christ to be who lives within you? What does that mean? What does it look like? How could that affect the rest of the world? Here's what it means. It means I give myself up and I follow what He instructed. Now the hard part about that, here's the hard part. I'm not very good at some things. I mean, there's some things I'm good at, some things I'm not. And if somebody says, hey, can you go and serve this person? There's an older couple, they need their house cleaned. I can tell you, and if you don't believe me, ask Elizabeth, I am not that great at cleaning. It's not my corner. I don't organize things. I like my clutter. I like stuff kind of piled up, and I'll figure out where it's at when I need it. Don't move it or I'm completely lost. I'm probably lost even if you don't move it, but it gets me frustrated when you do move it. I mean, it's chaos sometimes. She likes order and things to be neat, to put where it is, so when she needs it, she knows where it's at. But somebody says, hey, there's an older couple, they need their house cleaned. They don't know the gospel. When you go over there, can you clean their house? Can you teach them the gospel? And can you take some food to them? I'm not good at cleaning. Sorry, I'm not good at that. Find somebody else. Would Jesus take the opportunity to clean their home? Because if I am crucified with Christ and it's no longer I who live, I've got to start living making decisions based on how Jesus would make his decisions. I don't have the greatest voice in the world. I don't want to sing out. Do you know that singing is instructed 9 times in the New Testament? 9 times. That's it. 5 of those times tied to the word sing is instruction of how to sing and what to sing. God tells us to sing hymns and spiritual songs. So we get hymns, we go to the book of Psalms. When we look at spiritual songs, we look at songs that are written within our songbook. Anything outside of that, God does not want brought to him. That's not worship. If I sing Rocky Top, that's not worship. Singing something that is outside of the hymns and the spiritual songs removes me from worship of bringing it to God. So when I bring something to God, he tells me what he wants me to sing. He tells me how he wants me to sing it. He said, I want you to sing with your mouth to edify other people, and I want you to sing with your heart, that you mean what you say. So those are 2 of the instructions he gives about singing. So we know that he said to sing hymns and spiritual songs. We know that he said to sing with my mouth. We know that he says to edify everyone else, so it has to be out loud, otherwise you don't know what I'm singing. And he tells me that he wants me to give that praise to him. What if I add something? The boat's going to sink. What if I change something? I do it a different way. I know it. Here's another problem that we have in the church today. When we get so focused on, does my voice sound good enough to sing with? We're in the same problem that caused the first division of the church. The reason they added instruments at the very beginning of the church, when they had the first church split, was they wanted it to sound better. When my heart and mind is focused on how I sound more than what I am giving to God and giving to my brothers and sisters in Christ, then I might as well start another denomination that's based on sound. The preacher didn't sound good enough, so I don't want to be in that congregation anymore. Did he teach truth? Because that's all that God asked us to do, was teach the truth. Did my singing sound good enough? Because if all I'm focused on is the sound, then I might as well start another denomination based on sound. Was the prayer, did it sound heartfelt enough? Well, I might as well start another denomination if I'm basing it off of sound. Because God only told me to be genuine to him. God only told me to follow his instructions, that what he gave me is the only thing that I go by. I don't go by what I carry, what I think, how I feel, because I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer me, it is Christ who lives within me. My decisions need to come from what Jesus said for the church, and nowhere else. Anywhere else that I pull from, I'm living in sin to God because I'm not obeying his commands. I'm adding mahogany to the gopher wood. I'm adding pine and cedar because I think they're better. I think they'll last in the water longer. I'm building fire a different way because I'm better at it this way. I'm not as good at it the way that God wanted it. I'm better at it how I want to do it. And that's not acceptable. I want to bring something that God did not ask for. I bring some good stuff. But it's not what he asked for because I don't have a clue what's in his word. And God told Cain, I don't accept it, Cain. And that ticked him off. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world today that can hear the truth, and the truth's going to tick them off. And they're going to choose to leave. That's where evangelists need to go back and try to bring them home. That's where we as Christians have been given the Great Commission. Mark 16 says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. That's not an option. That's a command from God. If I have not taught the gospel, if I don't teach the gospel, then I'm disobeying God the Father. And that needs to be repented of. If I don't sing out to edify my brothers and sisters in Christ, if I'm so quiet that I can't edify anyone, then I'm disobeying God's command. And that needs to be repented of. If I don't pray to God the Father, then I am disobeying God's command, and it needs to be repented of. We wonder so often, why does the church struggle in America in 2022? Generally, it's because the people that say they're part of the church don't look any different than the rest of the world. We make our decisions the same way the rest of the world does. How does it benefit me? Well, how do I want to spend my time? What do I want to do? If you're a Christian, now listen to me very closely. With your Bible open to Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Listen very closely. If you are a Christian, you have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer you that lives, but Christ that lives within you. When we make that decision that I'm going to carry the name of Christ, then we've got to stop saying what we want and start living the way Jesus instructed. Live the way that he would, because you'll never comprehend or understand the love that Christ had if you don't follow his example. His love carried him through torture. The love that Jesus had was strong enough to overcome any temptation he faced. If Jesus' love wasn't strong enough to overcome temptation, then he couldn't get on the cross and you and I wouldn't be here today. We'd be hell-bound and no luck to share with one another. But Jesus' love for us gave him the strength that he overcame every temptation ever put in his face. I want you to think about some of the people that Jesus was surrounded by. Jesus walked into rooms where there would be tax collectors and people that would steal and feel no remorse. And yet Jesus never stole a penny. Jesus would walk into a room where there would be harlots and prostitutes, and yet he would never give in to what they were offering. Jesus would be surrounded by people who were flat out liars so that they would have an advantage over someone else, and yet Jesus always told the truth. Jesus would walk up to this place in the desert when he was starving and hungry and be offered an opportunity to make bread from stones, and yet would not serve himself if it would cost you and me anything. Jesus would not serve himself if it cost you and me anything. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives within me. Church, we've got to get back to knowing how Jesus lived. How did Jesus make decisions? What is the character and the nature of Christ? Because if he lives within me, I've got to start stepping up. My sense of morality needs to move up, not staying the same. Watch as he continues that verse. The life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and he gave himself for me. This morning we've got those questions. What do we give? What do we give up? What do we change? What do we do? There are things in our own lives each and every day that need to be repented of, that need to be changed, that need to be given back. They need to be offered in the correct way. They need to be studied to find the evidence without the opinion. Maybe this morning you don't know how to teach the gospel. What can we do about that? I would gladly teach you how to teach it. And maybe you don't know the gospel. I would love to sit down with you today, because the greatest thing about our God is he provides opportunities. Not opportunities through one person. There are many people in this congregation right now that can teach the gospel. They can share the gospel. And if you want to know what is the gospel and how do I share that with someone, we can answer both of those questions today. And what better day than a day that the world says is Jesus' day, that we're going to celebrate his birth. That we're going to spend a little bit of time focused on, hey, Jesus lived in this world. What greater time to spend saying, here's how we teach the gospel. Here's what the gospel means. The death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. His life that he lived here, his hanging on the cross, his opportunity for each of us to be obedient to that I would be crucified with Christ. It's no longer me. It's no longer my excuses. It's no longer my desires, my wants, my personal preferences, but it's Christ that lives in me. Can you imagine if Jesus could walk around a city? And imagine if he's walking through Philippi, or maybe he's walking through Iconium, or maybe he's walking through Antioch. And maybe Paul and Silas are in prison. And maybe Paul's voice wasn't that great. And maybe Paul's singing out. Maybe Jesus walks down to where the cell is. And Paul's just got done writing the Philippians letter. And he tells them that he wants them to rejoice. And Jesus walks down to the cell and says, Paul, shh, you sound terrible. I don't want to hear that anymore. Can you imagine? But so often we treat ourselves that way, right? We think he doesn't want to hear us because we don't sound good enough. Paul sang out to the point the guy keeping the prison was listening and learning. He wasn't just listening. He was learning about God based on what Paul was singing. Peter would be teaching through the way that he would sing as he was put into a prison. When we get the Philippian jailer, he's getting ready to just go ahead and end his own life because he knows what's coming. But because Paul says, hey, don't do any harm to yourself. We're all still here. He says, dude, I've been listening to you guys sing. What do I need to do to be saved? A man singing, because God commanded it, saved the souls. Now hear me on this, church. Saved the souls of not only the jailer, but his wife and his children. You want to get your children to heaven, it's time to step it up. Let's follow the life that Christ lived, because it's no longer I, but Christ who liveth within me. This morning, if you need an opportunity to say, God, I need to set some things straight. That's what a church family is about. We're a small army that fights together and says, if you need us, we got you. We're here together. When we skip out on worship, that needs to be repented of. When we refuse to sing, we're to sing out. That needs to be repented of. Lack of prayer, it needs to be repented of. The rejection of anything that God commanded needs to be repented of. And that's why we're here together. So we can fight together. But maybe this morning you haven't obeyed the gospel and you need to be immersed in the water to be buried with Christ. We give you that opportunity as well as we stand and as we sing.